Look, we're an intimate crowd, if you will, and I only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to get right into it. What I hope to do is just give you a couple points of food for thought, because this is going to go in such a short amount of time. In the grand scheme of your work lives, this is a veritable sneeze in the hay fever of your life. So I know that there's only so much I can do. So what I'm going to attempt to do is just share with you just a few talking points from a really important study that we've conducted in executive education at LBS. One of the wonderful things that we try to do is gain knowledge from our participants, not just the other way around. And what was particularly useful about the study I'm going to share with you is that the people who participated are all in what we'll call Generation Y, which I'll define for us in a minute, just so we're all on the same page. But more importantly, they were all on a program called Leading Teams for Emerging Leaders, or the Emerging Leaders Program. What's important about that is, by virtue of being nominated and sponsored by their programs to attend, we know that they are pre-qualified, if you will, to be the leaders of the future. Right? They are more likely than just a sample of Gen Ys. So, and this led us to ask a really interesting question. And that is, I think there's been plenty of literature on these Gen Ys, how do you lead these pesky Gen Ys? We've heard that to death, and I'm sure we all sort of understand the literature on that. What I haven't read so much about is, how will these Gen Ys lead? If they have different paradigms, or what Professor Jim Clausen calls VABES, which is values, attitudes, beliefs, and expectations. If those are so different from ours, then surely when they assume the C-suite, the board, the CEO, they will be leading in a way that is qualitatively different from what we are used to. So that's what we're going to try and explore a little bit today, because there must be implications for HR. First, let's just make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what we mean with generations. Now, there is no consensus on what exactly the different generations are in terms of the years of birth, nor is there exact consensus on their definitions. So I'm just going to use broad working definitions for the context and purpose of today. You might have different views about these, and that's absolutely fine. The silent generation are those born roughly between 1925 and 1942. Now, when we talk about generations, it isn't really so important about what years they were born. The reason that there is any generational band, and then all of a sudden there's a new generational band, has nothing to do with a year per se. It has to do with the sociological, economic, and political trends that were occurring in one's formative years. Then that creates VABES for that person. So then when they enter the workforce, they bring those values and attitudes, beliefs with them. Now, because these trends are different from generation to generation, some were raised in turmoil, some were raised in eras of rebellion against institutions. Some were raised when institutions were being entrenched and conservatism was in their region or country. And obviously these all have impact. Now, as I go through these, you will also think, well, I can think of several people who don't resemble what Adam is saying. Of course, these are generalizations. That means there are outliers, and in fact, there are going to be many outliers. Generalization by definition is just that. But the silent generation, of course, are all pretty much retired now, and they are the last generation who would be able to actually say, I was able to retire at what we sort of broadly consider retirement age, or even retire early. Baby boomers, born between 1943 and 1960, roughly. Do we have any baby boomers in the audience? Congratulations, you all get to retire. Well done. Now, for the rest of us, Gen X. Any Gen X's in the audience? Me too. Welcome, welcome. So, we're not going to be so cool with the retirement, or more accurately, our pensions aren't going to be so cool with our retiring. So a portfolio career as we enter the sunset of our lives are probably what's in store for us. And that is affecting, even as we speak, how we think about the world of work. Any Gen Ys born between roughly 1982 and 2004? Thank you. Well, you probably have a completely different definition of what it means to be an employee, and indeed what it is to be an employer and what that value proposition is. There's a very different loyalty back and forth here, and I'll give you some evidence about what that is. Now, I've given this type of talk a few times, and every time I've said, there's anyone from Generation Z in the audience? No one has ever raised their hand, but I think we have one. Welcome. Finally, we finally have a plural in the audience, one whose vabes, I would imagine, are so different from anyone in this room that when someone gets up and talks about your generation in 10 years' time, it's going to be completely astounding and nothing I can even forecast today. But Gen Ys. This all started with some anecdotal conversations, as it so often does, which led me to ask a question. And research generally starts with someone asking themselves a question and trying to answer it. What I noticed were people saying, and I was talking mainly among my colleagues who were Gen Xs, and they said, it's funny, our grandparents tended to have one employer, maybe two. My grandfather had one employer, and he actually had the same job for his entire professional life. He worked for 38 years and was retired for 35. Final salary pension scheme, right? And our parents typically had 3-4 employers, which means, and at the rate at which Gen Xs are changing careers, means that we'll have about 7 to 8 employers in our lifetime. And at the rate at which Gen Ys are changing their jobs, they are likely to have 15 to 16 employers in their lifetime, if their current rates continue. So does that mean, speaking of Gen Z, we'll have 32 employers in their lifetime? Well, it's very possible. But of course, this really changes the proposition of what it means to work here. And of course, there is a pattern here, right? I bolded the numbers. I'll make it even simpler. It looks like in every generation, roughly, the number of employers in one's career doubles. So then I thought, well, why is that? Because that's astounding. Well, I asked myself, let's use the Gen Ys that we have at LBS. They were all in the Gen Y space, and anyone who wasn't in Gen Y or millennial, I'm not using millennial because there is some confusion. Sometimes it's used to describe actually Generation Z, and even sometimes for those older in the Gen X segment. So I tend not to use the word millennial just to avoid confusion. But everyone who participated in the survey were Gen Ys. We do 2 cohorts per year, and we've been asking them for 5 years to complete this survey. And then I follow up qualitatively to get more detailed qualitative information from them. They come from all over the world, and as you can imagine from London Business School, there is a heavier concentration, as you'd expect in Europe and the Middle East. But it really is a global group that there is no trend in terms of industry that they come from or function in terms of their job. It is incredibly diverse. In fact, I think only about 5% of the group are even from Britain, so it isn't even British heavy. We asked them first question, how long do you expect to stay with an employer? So when you start your job, what does that little voice in your head tell you in terms of how long you're going to stay in that job? 11 plus years, 6 to 10, 3 to 5, 1 to 2 years. Well, the 11 plus years were only 5%. Now, I thought surely from this point, it's going to shoot up. But the next group, 6 to 10 years, was still only 5%. For 3 to 5 years, 53%, which of course means there's still a whopping 37% that said that when they start work with an employer, they are planning to leave within 24 months. And I tested this with London Business School, some of my Gen Y colleagues. I said, this is the data I'm getting. Does this make sense to you when you join an employer? Are you thinking, actually, in about 2 years, I'm moving on? Almost across the board, they said, yep, probably so. But they qualified it. They said, if I don't get constant new challenges and opportunities, absolutely. And I thought, well, how frequently do you need a new opportunity? We're going to come to that in a minute. But this is just, a fascinating figure for me. Because, of course, one has to ask oneself, does it have, what does it mean in terms of long-term benefits, right? Anything which vests, or anything which really only, comes of age after a number of years, be it extra holiday, be it extra, pension contribution, whatever it is, does it matter given this proposition? Well, so I asked them, all right, well then when you do start with an employer, what's important to you? We gave them a number of options, and we asked them to rate their top 3 choices and to rank them. So number 1, number 2, number 3, and it was weighted. So someone who gave an answer as number 1, that was weighted more heavily than what they would give a number 2 or a number 3 answer. Work-life balance, CEO reputation, promotion opportunities, bonus, share price, openness to innovation, benefits, organizational culture, corporate social responsibility. Well, the number 3 most popular weighted answer were promotion opportunities. And here's where this question comes in play, where I said, when would you move if you don't sort of get a new challenge? So one of the participants on the Leading Teams for Emerging Leaders program came to me and she said, I'm really glad my company sent me on this program, but, I still haven't been promoted, so I'm thinking of moving on, any time now. As soon as I get back, I'm thinking of tendering my resignation. I said, I'm really sorry about that. To hear that, it's a shame that your company isn't giving you more opportunities. How long have you been there? She said, 6 months. I thought, okay, so we're definitely talking about a paradigm that was, until that point, unfamiliar to me. The number 2 most popular answer was organizational culture. So what does it mean to work here? And as I started asking about details around that, they actually said, well, I chose that, but it's not so much organizational culture, it's really team. So the immediate people that I work with. That spirit of in that team is so important. We say, I'm sure you've all heard the old adage, you don't quit your job, you quit your boss. Well, I think they would say you don't quit your job, you quit your team. If the team isn't constantly creating cohesion, opportunity, support, challenge, and this has incredible implications for us thinking in particular about learning and development. Because now we're thinking, well, is learning and development really the model where one finds a high potential and then raises that person through learning and development? Or do we have to think about learning and development opportunities that are in teams so that they develop a common set of vocabulary, common set of objectives, give them a challenge, offer them an experiment, support that action planning back in the workplace? And it's really for us redefining the meaning of organizational learning. Because not only is that going to be helpful, I think, for the individual and for the team, it might actually even help the organization in terms of retention. Now, the number 1 answer, and some of you may predict this, work-life balance. Now, here's where I encounter definite differences of opinion, and these differences of opinion tend to be along generational lines about, does work-life balance mean they don't wish to work? Oh, they're lazy bastards. That isn't the case at all. What's more likely is, and I've asked them about this, they said, no, not at all. What it means is I might want to, not come in on a Wednesday afternoon to join, play with my football league, but then I'm going to work on Saturday morning, or I might work late Tuesday night, and that means I might come in late Wednesday morning. But actually, the total number of hours worked is same or greater than Gen X or Baby Boomer. So putting some information together, 90% planning to leave within 5 years, 3 to 5 years, 37% within 24 months. This was fascinating too. 54% said they were more loyal to their team than to their organization. Now you may think, well, 54%, that's only slightly over 50%. I would turn that around and say, it's significant that over 50% say they're more loyal to their team than to their organization. Because again, this leads one to think, well, then how does one promote people from within? How does one keep people? How does one create a culture where do we have to think about organizational culture, or do we really have to think about team ethos? And employer value factors don't include extrinsic drivers, salary, bonus, etc. Now, I'm not saying that they have no factor. Of course, they are a factor. They just aren't the top 3. And this is really important. There's a lot of literature going on right now on the purpose and meaning of work and how that is evolving. And then one of the strongest themes that's coming out that's in common with all the literature is that intrinsic drivers are ever more important. So what does it mean to work here? Why do you work? Is that aligned with your organization's definition of what work is? So there are absolute implications here, and I think I talked about talent development and promotion implications. I think what's also important is starting to think about a paradigm whereby one accepts that you're not going to keep an employee for one's whole career. But can one create either intrinsic or extrinsic motivators to encourage people to come back, acknowledging they're not going to stay for 38 years like my grandfather? But how do we make that welcome, possible, and indeed not stigmatized? That if you leave, you gain development, you gain experience, you gain leadership opportunities. By the way, not at the company's expense, and then we get all that back several years down the line. There is actually a case to be made that that could be a valuable paradigm to consider, and I know that it's going to be complex. And can employers focus development and engagement, as I say, more on teams than on individuals? So there, in terms of hierarchy, I think there's also something to consider, and that is advancement is not necessarily linear. Because Gen X don't worship at the altar of linear advancement, so long as they are always getting meaty opportunities. So when I asked this woman, again, she wasn't promoted within 6 months of joining the company, I said, "Will nothing make you stay?" She said, "No, if I'm given a really interesting opportunity, even if it's in another team or in another function or in another country, that would be really interesting." So we have to think lateral rather than linear. We have to think long-term. And short-term. It's balancing those two views together. Because, of course, to the Gen X, every opportunity is a network of possible wanderings. It's what baby boomers and portfolio careers might think about in terms of their careers now. The issue is that people are thinking about doing so in their 20s. Now, if every opportunity is an adventure in its own right, then, of course, we have to conclude that there probably isn't such a thing as a fully attained one definition of leadership. That leadership isn't even necessarily contextual to the organization, but leadership is going to be attuned and defined by the myriad of experiences in different industries, employers, and functions that an individual has in their X many years career. And this is also something to consider. There's a wonderful piece of book that's going to be coming out, I believe at the early 2016, by Professors Andrew Scott and Linda Grattan at London Business School. It's going to be called The 100-Year Life. And it's based on this fact. Over half the babies born in the West since 2007 are going to live to be over 100. Not only their life will be longer, but their quality of life will extend longer, so their work life, their productive work hours will be longer. How much longer? Approximately double that of baby boomers today. So babies born now will work or can work twice as long in their lifetime than people who will be entering retirement in the next 10 to 20 years. What that means is that options are much more important because one inevitably is looking at all the options one has in one's career if one is considering a 60-year career. So, of course, there's going to be mobility. Of course, people are going to consider, if I don't have another meaty opportunity within 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, I'm going to find it elsewhere. Because they have time. Time is on their side. When one's career was 38 years, like my grandfather, you sort of had to pick a path and stick with it. Because you didn't have much time to build up your professional reputation, your pension, build your salary raises, etc. Babies born today have time on their side. That's not necessarily great news for employers unless we also embrace that paradigm change. So, it's about progression, perhaps rather than promotion, and it's about creating a portfolio of opportunities that speak to intrinsic drivers: responsibility, recognition, learning, joy. I talked about the purpose and meaning of work. Social psychologists are saying that this is probably going to be the defining driver of work life over the next 40, 50 years. So really being crisp about how we help create and retain and build intrinsic drivers and help people tap into why they come into work in whatever that context is. So, what will matter to the Gen Y CEOs? Because, of course, while lateral might be more common than linear, at some point, we all have got to hire a CEO in the next generation. We have a few leading indicators of what the Gen Y CEO might be like. We try to get a sense of that by asking this question of our Gen Y participants. What type of CEO will you emulate? So which mantra, if you will, is most important for you? Would you focus on how the business is trading? Would you focus on global impact? Would you try to, even if your company is large, would you try to retain that entrepreneur's point of view? Would you focus on renewing personal mission? How do I make my organization and the world a fundamentally better place? Or focus on the financial worth of the business? These are all quite common and different leadership drivers. Well, the response was almost as dramatic as the how long are you going to stay with the company. 11.5% said they would focus on how the business is trading. So the fundamentals, per store sales, per unit sales, etc. So it's the strategy dynamics approach to leadership. Global impact was still 11.5%. The entrepreneur's point of view, which of course makes sense in a world where one has to be more agile year by year, was quite a bit larger, 33%. So we only have two choices left: mission, financial value, shareholder value. Well, personal mission got a whopping 43%. Now, I'm going to take 3 seconds for you to do the math. Okay, that means the number of people who said financial worth is my primary driver is 1%. Let me say that again. 1% of Gen Y CEOs care about shareholders effectively. Now, can I see a show of hands? Does that scare you? Fantastic. Lovely. I've been in audiences where about 3/4 of them were wetting their trousers about now. Granted, it was a banking audience. And the point I was making to that audience was, the financial analysts in the room, I was saying your ethos is not in line with the CEO of the future. The short-term, ratio-driven, what have you done for me lately approach is not aligned to the leader's ethos in the immediate future. And I think what more accurately is going to happen is that the analyst community is going to have to change their approach versus the CEOs. Now, there are going to be years of conflict until that settles down. But I do think that's the way the balance of power, if you will, is going to go. We already have a leading driver of that with the CEO of Unilever, who said, I only owe you an annual report. I'm not going to send you quarterly forecasts anymore, because you know what? It doesn't help my ability to make investment decisions that help my long term. And your ratios have nothing to do with my organizational purpose, why we went into business in the first place. And this is a conversation that analysts are going to be having, I think, in more and more shareholder conferences. So I think what's really important now is the idea for leaders to not only think that they have the ability to think long-term, but that they are given the permission to think long-term. Because, of course, one may argue that that might actually smooth out volatility, both in financial markets as well as in business itself. And if you don't believe me, let me just take 2 examples of very different paradigms of how a leader speaks to one's investors. Warren Buffett, chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, the Oracle of Omaha, the darling of the baby boomer generation, the guardian of many a pension. And full disclosure, I'm an investor in Berkshire Hathaway, so I'm not denigrating Warren Buffett. Love him to death. But his conversation is very different with shareholders. He says, this was the 2013, I believe, shareholder report, and I'm going to try and say this as dramatically as I can, but it is challenging. Berkshire's gain in net worth during 2013 was $34 billion. Over the last 49 years, book value has grown from $19 to $134,000, a rate of 19.7% compounded annually. Now, that's a great return, don't get me wrong. Love it to death. Good for my pension. Look at Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, who says in the IPO, Facebook was not originally created to be a company. It was built to accomplish a social mission, to make the world more open and connected. We think it's important that everyone who invests in Facebook understands what this mission means to us, how we make decisions, and why we do the things we do. I will try to outline our approach in this letter, i.e., if you want me to produce the hockey stick projections, forget it. Now, does that sound like a paradigm we just talked about? You remember this? Focus on renewing personal mission. How do I make my company and my world a fundamentally better place? He's practically the poster child for that paradigm. And clearly, the financial analysts, the financial community, the pension managers had to get on board with that if they were interested in investing in Facebook, because Mark was not going to change his tune. You might think, well, that's all fine and good, Adam, but, Warren Buffett gave you 20% compound annual growth rate. Mark Zuckerberg, young punk kid, doesn't care about ratios. What's he going to do for you? I'll tell you what he did for me. 100% compound annual growth rate since 2012. 100% compound annual growth rates. If you pull out your IBM business calculator and start doing some of those, it's looking pretty damn good, despite the fact that he's essentially, blowing raspberries at the financial analyst community. So, of course, this means that for the Gen Y CEO, though, these will be challenges. It will be challenging to balance long-term sustainability with the seduction of short-term, right? In order to hit that quarterly forecast, can we cut costs now? Can we do something right now that will, have a better forecast? But what's the impact of that long-term when you do that? And every time you make that decision, isn't that a step closer to drift on your purpose? Because you're not making decisions anymore on why you got into business, whatever that purpose is. Social currency is, of course, much more important than personal currency. This is the social networked age. And actually, avoiding too much exposure to the limelight is important. If this is about community, then this is no longer the era of the personality of the CEO, right? The Lee Iacocca, Jack Welch era is dead. And in fact, employees don't buy it, don't like it, don't want to hear it. They want to feel that we are, if you will, a community of equals. And we have nominated, we are represented by one among equals, who is our CEO. And that requires really careful attention to communications, internal and external. Active listening, right? It's pulling collective wisdom from the organization and then feeding that back out into one's market. And then, of course, nurturing the culture. Since organizational culture, what it means to work here, is ever more important. Now, if the CEO of the future can do that, other than the challenges that inevitably face us in HR, if we just look at this from a humanistic point of view, if one makes work-life worth working for, particularly if one is going to work for 50, 60 years in one's career, then surely isn't that an ethos to embrace because it makes work-life worth living? Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, I know I'm out, so I will stay up here for about 20 minutes to answer those one-on-one. Thanks very much. Enjoy Barcelona. Get out of your rooms and enjoy the town because it's fantastic in the evening. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.